coming up.
Okay, so let's take Mr. Jenis isn't here. I mean, he's a lot of places. Right here isn't one of them right now. He will be joining us later, I'm sure. Now, let's take his example where he had spoken about the Attorney General, for instance, and I assume this would be like a foreign entity has a dossier of some sort about an Attorney General, something like that. In that instance, how would Bill C-70, what positive impact would Bill C-70 have based on what you just said, the information sharing or the ability to alert?
I had a whole bunch of questions here specifically on C-70, but you've mentioned a few things that I just need to get a little more clarification on, or it's just going to bother me for a while. You mentioned that some of your colleagues have left to join other entities, and you mentioned specifically China. Could you give me some examples? Expand on that. What do you mean by that?
There's that transparency piece that is so essential to make sure Canadians know about it. So then at least if Canadians know about it, then they can make decisions accordingly. So is there... What should that mechanism in terms of transparency be? Should there be, bulletins, or is it enough to be on a list? Is it enough to make sure that, there's this coordination between different levels of law enforcement? What's the right level of transparency? Does there need to be more, or is what's proposed in the legislation, does it go far enough?
There's the framework that is right in place that allows CISIS to be able to provide that transparency to Canadians.
Mr. Vigneault said to the Oil Commission, the purpose of CISIS is to have secrets. Well, I hear what he's saying, but I think a sort of cult of secrecy may be going too far.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. Chair, we're pleased to answer your questions about the work underway at PSPC and our main estimates. Thank you. Merci.
I'll focus my remarks on Part 4 of Bill C-70, the Foreign Influence Transparency and Accountability Act part, because that impinges on the activities of agents of the Chinese Ministry of State Security, targeting politicians, civil servants, and others involved with shaping Canada's relations with the People's Republic of China regime. Now, Justice Ogg's report earlier this month noted that her mandate is to investigate potential foreign interference with, and I quote, executive decision-making by Cabinet and its ministers in relation to their departments, including indirect foreign interference with ministerial decisions when such decisions are based on information originating at a lower level of government, covertly influenced by a foreign state or its proxy agent, etc. That close the quote. I'm not sure why Justice Ogg's mandate is limited to a lower level of government covertly influenced by a foreign state. In the previous meeting of this committee, Mr. Jenis raised the possibility of a future Attorney General of Canada being in conflict of interest because he or she has benefited from foreign interference in his or her riding.
Now, you had highlighted relations with China in particular, but I'm concerned with all sorts of relations, as we all should be, when it comes to foreign interference. And you had mentioned a color coding system, and you had said this bill goes a long way to addressing this type of interference. Do I have that right?
Yes. Okay.
Can you expand on how and why that is?
Well, I think that the main thing is it empowers CISIS to inform people when there seem to be potential issues involving conflicts of interest for certain significant people influential in the decision-making process. And I think that's a very good thing.
Okay, so let's take Mr. Jenis isn't here. I mean, he's a lot of places. Right here isn't one of them right now. He will be joining us later, I'm sure. Now, let's take his example where he had spoken about the Attorney General, for instance, and I assume this would be like a foreign entity has a dossier of some sort about an Attorney General, something like that. In that instance, how would Bill C-70 what positive impact would Bill C-70 have based on what you just said, the information sharing or the ability to alert?
Well, I think the people that have to be alerted are the people who are potentially the subjects of this. I have an example of a young friend who was running for office in Saskatchewan who, I calculated was being engaged by agents potential agents of the Chinese state, proxies of the United Front Work Department, where they were offering him things and extensive praise. And I said, that this is how they start. They see him as an up-and-coming young man who may, in fact, someday be serving in our parliament, and they would like to cultivate good relations and possible sense of obligation to him. And I said, just be careful. In fact, he'll be speaking to CISIS about what happened. I think it's just a question that people don't know when they're subject to a sophisticated engagement by the very many agents of the Chinese state who are operating in our country.
Well, that's an interesting point. People don't even know. I mean, to me, the question would be, why isn't there training on this, that type of things? And obviously, as parliamentarians, as elected representatives, people should be aware. But from what you're saying, it's much more insidious, maybe surreptitious, that people may not even know it's occurring. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I've spoken to someone who was central in the development of the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, and he said that, perhaps the Act is not drafted very well, and perhaps the government of Australia has not allocated the resources to their security intelligence agencies to follow up on the Act, but simply the existence of the Act is a consciousness-raising device. And so I think a lot of people who might have been inclined to accept some sort of going easy on China in anticipation of future benefits will now be aware that, this is something which will not reflect well on them and makes them complicit in the Chinese regime, including all of the espionage and foreign subversive activities and genocide that regime is characteristic of. And so, I think the fact that we're talking about this is already a very positive thing in terms of raising people's awareness that they just shouldn't let the Chinese regime start to make them beholden to a regime which is hostile to our interests and is engaged, as General Eyre has said, in hybrid warfare against us already.
Thank you. Professor Kempa, how much time do I have, please, Chair? A minute and a half. Okay. Now, Professor Kempa, you had spoken about the country-agnostic nature of Bill C-70, which is something that, at first blush for me, I would be supportive of. Now, one of the reasons I suppose we would deal with that is we have a changing world, and different governments are going to have different mandates. Is there a compelling reason why we wouldn't apply the same standard, and a high standard at that, when it comes to transparency and the registry of any foreign agent?
I think the only reason has to do with capacity. So if you were to establish a registrar's office that would be responsible for maintaining the database and some information on the activities of all of the those seeking to impact Canadian policy and so forth, and outcomes in a legitimate fashion, the amount of information would simply be overwhelming, to the point that it would, a senior colleague of mine, Wesley Wark, refers it has the potential to develop into a form of almost security theater, where you have an office that exists that simply by trying to watch agents from around the world cannot. The idea being that if you were to focus your attention on updated and rolling lists for which there was evidence to suggest we should be focusing on certain regions, you would have more capacity in that institution.
Now, that could be addressed through regulation, obviously.
Yes.
Okay.
But I wonder if you could compare Bill C-70 to our Five Eyes partners and how it compares to the legislation that they have in place dealing with foreign interference.
Yeah, I would say one thing about country agnostic. I was invited down to the U.S. Congress to talk about Canada, China, and I mentioned the possibility of this legislation, and the American Congress people were not entirely happy about the idea that we were going to be requiring transparency of foreign influence because, they're foreign in Canada too. I was a bit taken aback by that. I think what the real difference is in terms of the U.S. FARA is the degree of resources and implementation and effectiveness of the legislation. Australia has been slow to bring people to account. I think they just did the first one. They've had the Act in since 2019, but when the Act came into effect, for example, the former Australian Minister of Trade and Investment, who had been responsible for shaping the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which, we did not regard that highly in terms of when we were thinking of doing free trade with China, and who negotiated a 99-year lease on the port of Darwin, Andrew Robb, that we subsequently found out had been being paid almost $800,000 a year by a Chinese billionaire associated with the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is the #1 agency for United Front work in China. He resigned from that consultancy just before the legislation came into effect. And we saw some other Australians who did that. So we might see a similar impact in Canada of people that decide that they'd rather not be associated with potential Chinese association. And I think Mr. Robb suggested that it was really the political pressure that caused him to resign. There's no suggestion he ever did anything that was against the law or anything like that. So I do think it's a question of how enthusiastically we decide to implement this legislation more than the legislation itself, and the extent to which we provide the resources necessary, and including to the Foreign Influence Commissioner, and the nature of the regulations that we decide to put into effect, and I guess who the government decides to appoint through Order in Council to that role. So, the legislation's one thing, but making it work is something else.
Parties have agreed to fast-track this bill. We recognize it's a priority, but how important are those resources to be attached to the legislation?
Well, obviously we need we need the security agencies and the RCMP to regard this as a priority area. But it's very difficult politically, because people who may have found themselves beholden to the Chinese state for whatever reason, whether it was something they did in China or China knows something about them, are not going to be supportive of the idea of this information coming to light. So from the point of view of the investigation agencies, and I think Mr. Kempa would know better than me, do they want to take up a case that's going to be controversial and cause kickback from the people that they are, important people in our government who may, in fact, be needing some guidance with regard to whether or not they're fully supporting Canadian interests and are not being partially compromised by the interests of a hostile foreign state. So, it's not going to be easy, and I think the role of the commissioner will be quite critical. And I do have some concerns about the nature of that appointment as an Order in Council appointment, and the provisions in the Act that allow that person to be removed at any time by the government. I don't know enough about the mechanisms of government, but I'd really prefer that there be a very high degree of independence to such a person.
I'd like to start first with Mr. Kempa, if I could. In your opening remarks, you mentioned that C70 was a good platform or a basis to get started on with this, and I tried to scribble down quickly what you had here, or what you said here, sorry. You mentioned that there was definitely a lack of RCMP capabilities to investigate, and that really needed to be built on, or really this legislation wasn't going to be that good. I didn't quite get completely what you meant there, and if you could really expand on that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, thank you. I think that what I was getting at is that given that we have a 5-year requirement to review this legislation, it enables us to come back to some of the lessons that we will pick up over how well the institutions on the ground, some of which are significantly evolving their mandates, are able to enact or carry out what you have here. So, in the 1980s, of course, the Emergencies Act, RCMP Act, CISIS Act were all written over a period of a couple of years with reference to one another. Obviously, CISIS being created from taking national security intelligence issues away from the RCMP. Given that there's an ongoing debate about the capacity of the RCMP to fulfill its federal policing functions, including investigations in national security, it's great if CISIS now becomes more effective at sharing information or intelligence with the RCMP, but if they're not in a position to carry that out, it will be very difficult. So there's an ongoing debate as to what the future of the RCMP will be. Will they carry on, and to To what extent with contract policing across the country? Will they become two organizations with one principally focused on federal policing issues? We don't have the answers to that today, nor will we have them in a year. But what we have laid out here would, and how the RCMP manages its new responsibilities with CISIS sharing information, could inform what's done with the RCMP Act in 5 years' time, for example, and the review of the CISIS Act in 5 years' time, taking into consideration what happens with the RCMP and CBSA, for that matter, and other partners down the line. So it's a learning basis here for what ends up working well and poorly for review in 5 years.
Thank you for that, and hopefully a lot of it works in the good way, not the poorly way. So, Mr. Burton, I have some questions for you. I had a whole bunch of questions here specifically on C70, but you've mentioned a few things that I just need to get a little more clarification on, or it's just going to bother me for a while. You mentioned that some of your colleagues have left to join other entities, and you mentioned specifically China. Could you give me some examples? Expand on that. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's certain agencies that are identified with promoting interests that favor greater engagement in Canada and China. So, the Canada-China Business Council, for example, the Asia-Pacific Foundation, the China Institute at the University of Alberta, are all institutions that enjoy funding, some of them from Chinese sources. In fact, the China Institute at the University of Alberta received 10-year sustaining funding from a Chinese billionaire who is vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. The University of Alberta will not say how much money or the terms of that funding, but one gets the feeling that if the University of Alberta's China Institute produced a report that was, say, supportive of this act, that funding might terminate. So, you have these very complicated relationships and interaction between people in the government and these agencies that are troubling to me. I mean, Senator Wu, for example, was associated with the Asia-Pacific Foundation for quite a long time and continues to support their purposes in Canada. So I can think of 3 ambassadors who are working in China trade. I mean, obviously, I don't think there's any harm in my mentioning John McCallum as someone who, has been highly regarded by China because the Chinese have said that in as many words, son of China, I believe they've referred to him as, and others that, I feel a little bit uncomfortable about the relationship, and then we have some cabinet ministers who also are working on things relating to China, which then causes me to wonder how they were performing when they were in a position of public trust. None of this. I mean, because we haven't got this commissioner set up yet, all of it is just smoke and mirrors. I can't condemn people. I think if anybody was doing anything illegal, that our RCMP would be pursuing it. But I just feel that there does seem to be a lot of Chinese influence in our country, which is why we have the commission going, and we need to root it out. And this legislation is particularly important in trying to maintain our security and sovereignty against a foreign threat.
Relevant to possibly foreign governments and individuals, like what's missing now or what should we be doing to enhance that level of transparency in Bill C-70, or is it appropriate as it is?
Well, I think that, there are clearly a lot of institutions that are pretending to be civil institutions that, in fact, we know from some of the leaked CISIS documents are in fact under the supervision of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. We know that those leaders, some of those leaders of some 100 and something numbers have been vetted by the Chinese embassy, and so one can assume that those institutions to some extent have a mandate to serve Chinese purposes, and they often have addresses which are the same as the so-called police stations that we are concerned about, where the Chinese government is engaging in activities off-site that probably are involving some degree of influence or espionage activities. So I think we need more transparency on that, and I think the commissioner can provide that kind of information so that people are aware when they're dealing with institutions that may have a function which serves the interests of a foreign state in addition to their social function. These are institutions that sign petitions in newspapers that support the Hong Kong national security law, or urge that Meng Wanzhou be released early, or other things that the Chinese government feels are positive and that probably most Canadians would feel are not in the Canadian interest. That being said, I think people have the right to have a political choice, and if their political choices correspond with the interests of China in Canada, that is well within their rights as Canadian citizens. What it really comes down to is, are they receiving funding or support from a foreign power? When you look at things coming up on the internet for elections, it's perfectly legitimate for governments to put together videos of politicians saying things they wish they hadn't said or doing things embarrassing. But if those videos are funded and supported by a foreign power, it's a different level of participation in our democratic process.
I think we're seeing that now with AI quite frequently. You also talked a little bit about the individuals on the other end of this question, and if someone is compromised and they're unaware of it, what should the process be, or what is the process for the administrative investigative on that end of it? How do they in layman terms contact those individuals and ensure, or are those individuals compromised in their situation of, say, their workplace or what have you? Like, what is the process there now? What's the UK do as far as trying to eliminate those type of compromised individuals that aren't even aware that they're possibly under the influence of foreign state actors?
Well, the UK has done some, they've exposed an actor who was active in funding political candidates and sent round a message to all of the MPs warning them about this individual. And they also found that there were staffers in parliamentary offices that they believe are under the influence of China, and there's now legal cases ongoing about that. I mean, we know from the CISIS documents about staffers in our parliament and parliamentarians that CISIS regards as being under the influence of a foreign power. They may sort of half understand the implications of what's going on, but I think once we have this process in place and we have the commissioner, that this commissioner can make it clear to people where the lines are in terms of one's engagement with a hostile foreign power, and inform, I guess, maybe inform their boss that your person may be providing information to a foreign power that you would prefer that not be provided to a foreign power.
I would ask, and I'll start with Mr. Burton and then go to Professor Kempa. You talked about that tension that needs to exist because somebody holding views is not necessarily the problem, but it's when it's a foreign state that is and there's influence in that process. So I'm just wondering, how do we square that circle, so to speak, to make sure that we can in fact have a framework that ensures that we are protecting our democratic infrastructure, research infrastructure, et cetera, while also protecting the freedoms and rights of Canadians, because there's a tension there. We have to make sure that we get it right. So I'd ask for your feedback, and if you have any specific suggestions about what that should look like in terms of the context of this bill, especially because there's such a tight deadline for amendments. Start with Mr. Burton.
Well, I mean, I certainly think that it's important that citizens of Canada should be serving the purposes of Canada and shouldn't have some remnant loyalties to a nation that their ancestors or themselves may have come from. And I do think that it's incumbent on us to have much more transparency in these matters. I mean, the Winnipeg lab matter, I suppose that the issue was that Professor Chiu was receiving benefits from China through these 1,000 Talents programs and other arrangements with the Wuhan Institute for Virology that she was not open about. And I think that, in terms of for example, the issue with Kenny Chiu, the main problem was that we couldn't find out where the WeChat and other Chinese websites information was coming from. Was it, domestic political preference, or was it something coming out of Beijing? We couldn't get any transparency on the sources. All of the stuff was under pen names and on websites that we couldn't associate with any existing institution, which, of course, by itself is suspicious. So I do think that we just have to know. And of course, we haven't talked about this, but I mean, the point of this legislation is not to prevent people from taking benefits from a foreign state, but being transparent about it. And, that would be a choice of Canadians. I receive funding from different foreign governments that have engaged my consulting services. I am only too happy, if called upon, to make that publicly known.
I appreciate that. Mr. Kempa,
a quick addition would be for the constant emphasis of the term clandestine in the legislation. So it's not the issue of influence at all. Canadian citizen is democratically permitted to overtly promote the interests of another state. It's the clandestine piece and the disclosure of any interest.
So there's a comparison made with the Ethics Act, and I know that I hear from constituents often that are frustrated. I also sit on the Ethics Committee, of which this issue has touched it. There's that transparency piece that is so essential to make sure Canadians know about it. So then, at least if Canadians know about it, then they can make decisions accordingly. So is there? What should that mechanism in terms of transparency be? Should there be, bulletins, or is it enough to be on a list? Is it enough to make sure that, there's this coordination between different levels of law enforcement? What's the right level of transparency? Does there need to be more, or is what's proposed in the legislation, does it go far enough? And I have one more quick question if we have time.
Well, I think the legislation is good. As I said before, I think it's really the regulations that are going to be the key here. There's still a lot of things that haven't been fully explained, including, as you say, those. How do you define those terms? And shouldn't we have terms that are very clear in these things? But my own feeling is, with regard to receiving benefits from abroad, that there shouldn't be any privacy allowed, that you have to be completely forthcoming about any conflicts of interest because of foreign money. And I think if people feel that violates their privacy, it's easy. Don't take any foreign money, then you won't have to talk about it.
That's great. Anything to add, Mr. Kempa?
No. Simply that annual reporting on the part of the Registrar's Office, which would be picked up on media and whatnot, would be very helpful.
We often talk about foreign interference, and we talk about cybersecurity, and we also talk about disinformation. One of the things that we talk about is whether or not our national security intelligence units have the ability to be able to be transparent about attacks that might be happening, that they stop. So, for example, around disinformation, often it's a way of actually communicating to the broader public that something's actually taken place and that's actually been stopped. And so I want to get perhaps your take first, Mr. Kempa, and then Mr. Burton, if he has something to add, whether or not there's the framework that is right in place that allows CISIS to be able to provide that transparency to Canadians.
Well, CISIS currently, and with this legislation, would have the transparency to report on essentially successes in addressing disinformation campaigns. I mean, the only thing that I would say is obviously they wouldn't release details that would let other entities know that they're capable or where they've successfully, because then those entities would simply change their tactics and so forth. But as part of CISIS's developing culture to inform the public and report, there's no reason that they couldn't do so in general terms.
Okay. Anything to add, Dr. Burton?
Yes, I've mentioned this before in Parliament that, compared to Australia, the United States, and Great Britain, our security agencies, up until maybe relatively recently, have been much less forthcoming about matters. Mr. Vigneault said to the Oil Commission, the purpose of CISIS is to have secrets. Well, I hear what he's saying, but I think a sort of cult of secrecy may be going too far. And if other nations are able to be more forthcoming and provide more information about foreign interference and influence operations in legal, their statement of claim in legal cases and so on, that Canada could start to do the same. But I defer to Mr. Kemp on this, but it seems it's a sort of cultural issue within our security agencies to be very much more reluctant than other nations to inform Canadians and Parliament about what they're doing.